The Ravi River ran fuller in the centuries when Harappa stood on its southwestern bank, fed by a wetter monsoon that reached further into the Punjab interior and retreated more slowly through the autumn months. The river brought annual silt floods in late summer, moving in broad brown sheets across the low ground between its channels and depositing the fine clayey loam that made the surrounding plain so persistently productive. To the east and to the west and to the north and south, the horizon was level and unbroken, the flat alluvial surface of the Punjab stretching to a distance beyond which the curvature of the earth removed it from sight rather than any change in the landform. Along the river margins grew stands of shisham and mulberry and tamarisk, the trees marking the edge of perennial moisture. Beyond them, the plain was a landscape of tall grasses and scrub acacia in the unirrigated areas, and of close cultivated fields in the zone where the irrigation channels could reach. Harappa grew on a gentle rise above the floodplain, the site itself an accumulation of earlier and earlier occupations stacked beneath the mature city that reached its peak around 2600 before the Common Era. The mounds of the city, later named Mound AB to the west and Mound E to the east, and Mound ET and Mound F at the northern margins, barely lifted above the surrounding plain, in a way that a traveler arriving from the south across the flat fields would have read as a slight thickening of the earth against the sky, before the walls and platforms resolved into distinct forms. At full extent, the site covered roughly 150 hectares, a surface area that placed it among the largest inhabited places of its time in the world. Though the 150 hectares included open space, irrigation features, and agricultural plots within the site boundary, as well as the dense built fabric of the residential and civic quarters. The topsoil beneath the city ran deep, 3 to 4 meters in places, laid down by thousands of years of flood deposition before the first Harappan structures were raised on it. In the deepest excavation sections, below the mature city and below the transitional deposits that preceded it, the ghost outlines of the earliest occupation appeared, pits and post alignments and fragments of fired brick from phases of settlement that had been accumulating and reorganizing themselves on this ground for centuries before the grid streets and the covered drains of the mature phase were established. The site was inherited and built upon and remade across generations, the ground holding the full record of that accumulation in the density and layering of what it contained. The river itself was both resource and constraint. At the high flood stage, in August and September, the Ravi pushed brown water against the lower margins of the city, its level elevated by the monsoon contribution from its upper catchment in the Himalayan foothills and the Siwalik Hills. The brick drains that ran beneath the city streets were partly designed for this. They moved surface water away from the built area and toward the river margin before it could pool in the lanes or penetrate the lower courses of the house walls. By March and April, as the snowmelt from the mountains sent a secondary pulse of water down the river, the irrigation channels cut from the Ravi banks could be kept full with minimal labor, and the wheat fields that ran in long strips perpendicular to the river were well watered through the final weeks of the growing season. By May and June, before the monsoon arrived, the river level dropped and the channels were managed more carefully, the water distributed according to a pattern of allocation that left no visible administrative record, but whose logic is implied by the regularity and extent of the irrigated area. The paleoclimate record for the Punjab in the centuries of Harappan florescence points toward conditions somewhat wetter than the present, a stronger and more penetrating monsoon that delivered more consistent rainfall to the areas between the major river channels and allowed farming to extend into zones that are today marginal or dry. The alluvial plain that surrounded the city was not the semi-arid landscape it appears as now. It was a managed agricultural environment of considerable productivity, its fields renewed annually by the silt that the flood deposited across the low ground, its margins held in check by the brick drains and the earthen bunds that controlled the movement of floodwater. The soil that the farmers of Harappa worked was among the most responsive in the ancient world, and the city that grew on it over 7 centuries was, in a direct sense, a product of the river and the plain as much as of the people who built its walls. The streets of the mature city followed a logic of alignment and regularity that is immediately apparent in the excavated plan. The major arteries ran roughly north to south and east to west, the grid close to the cardinal points, but not precisely fixed to them, varying by a few degrees in different parts of the site, which may reflect the practical necessity of aligning streets to the local topography of the mound surface rather than to any astronomical ideal. The principal thoroughfares were 6 to 9 meters across, their surfaces of rammed earth and compacted silty clay, worn smooth by foot traffic and by the solid wooden wheels of carts. Service passages between the backs of houses in adjacent blocks were less than 2 meters wide and were used for the removal of waste and the delivery of fuel. What gave the streets their functional character was the system of covered drains that ran beneath them. Along the center or margins of every major lane, brick-lined channels carried wastewater from the houses on either side. The channel covers, flat-fired brick slabs or corbelled arches of smaller bricks, set flush with the street surface or slightly raised above it. Into these main drains fed individual household drains, small ceramic pipes or brick-lined channels that pierced the house walls below grade and carried the liquid waste of bathing, washing, and cooking from the interior of the house to the street channel, which discharged at the city margins into low-lying collecting areas near the river. The drains were maintained continuously across the centuries of occupation. Blocked sections were cleared, covers replaced when broken, connections between house and main drain rebuilt as the houses themselves were rebuilt above them. The stratigraphic sections of the drain walls showed the same layered sequence of repair and rebuilding that characterized the house walls beside them. Every brick in the city, in the drains, and in the houses, and in the platform retaining walls, and in the well linings, conformed to the same proportional system. A Harappan-fired brick was made so that its width was twice its thickness and its length 4 times its thickness, a ratio that remained consistent across the site regardless of the absolute dimensions of individual bricks, which ranged from small drain cover bricks of about 7 centimeters thickness to large platform bricks of 10 centimeters or more. The standardization was not approximate. Bricks from different parts of the site and from different stratigraphic phases can be shown to follow the 1:2 ratio within small tolerances, the variation attributable to the normal slight differences in clay body and firing conditions rather than to any departure from the intended proportion. A mason working on a repair in the drainage system of Mound E in 2100 before the Common Era could use bricks from a storehouse that had been fired 3 generations earlier and find them dimensionally compatible with the courses he was replacing. The western mound, Mound AB, was the most substantially built precinct of the city. Its platform, elevated several meters above the surrounding plain, was surrounded by massive retaining walls of fired brick, some of them 3 or more meters thick at the base, their outer faces battered slightly inward to shed water and distribute the load of the fill behind them. The platform surface carried a series of long, narrow brick-walled structures arranged in parallel rows, their floors elevated on short brick piers above a ventilated plinth. These structures have been interpreted as granaries, storage facilities for the grain surplus that the surrounding agricultural hinterland produced, managed by some civic or administrative function that the Harappan material record does not define with precision. Immediately to the north of these storage structures, close to the edge of the mound and near the river, a series of circular brick platforms surrounded by low brick collars were probably threshing floors or grain processing areas, the location allowing the prevailing westerly wind to carry the chaff away from the cleaned grain. In the residential quarter of Mound E, the houses were arranged in blocks separated by the lanes of the city grid. Each house occupied a footprint of several rooms arranged around a central courtyard open to the sky. The courtyard was the working center of the household, receiving light and air and providing a space for food preparation, craft activity, and the daily tasks of water carrying and fuel management. Interior rooms surrounding the courtyard were used for sleeping, storage, and in some cases for intensive craft production. Upper stories, reached by fired brick stairways, whose treads survive in the excavation sections, provided additional sleeping space and access to the flat roof, which in the hot months of May and June would have served as the principal sleeping surface for the household. Every house had a connection to the street drain, and most had a small bathing chamber, a room with a waterproofed floor of brick set in impermeable lime mortar, raised slightly at the edges to keep water from spreading into the adjacent rooms. In the residential blocks of Mound E, the working day began in the courtyard. The cooking fires that had been banked the night before were rebuilt before first light. Fed with dung cake and small diameter wood collected from the stands of shisham along the river margin and with the dried reed that grew at the edges of irrigation channels. Ash deposits near the southeastern corners of interior rooms, where the cooking hearths were most commonly placed, contained the charred remains of these fuels in concentrations that reflected daily use across long periods. The hearth clay reddened, and the floor plaster immediately surrounding it stained with carbon from the accumulated fires of generations. The morning meal was prepared in ceramic storage jars that had been filled the previous evening. Wheat or barley flour mixed with water and set on a fired ceramic griddle over the open hearth, or a thick broth of lentils that had been soaking in a vessel overnight, brought slowly to temperature over the rebuilt fire. Water came not from the river, but from the wells that stood in the courtyard, or in a small chamber adjacent to it, or from the street corner wells that served the blocks whose houses lacked an individual well. The Harappan well was engineered with a care that reflects the importance of reliable water access in a city of this density. The lining was of fired brick tapered so that the individual bricks were wider at the bottom than at the top, allowing the cylinder of the lining to narrow slightly as it rose. This taper counteracted the inward pressure of the surrounding soil, which in the soft alluvium of the Punjab would have caused an untapered cylinder to bow inward and collapse after a few years of use. The tapered well linings at Harappa survived in some cases for the entire duration of the occupation of the house. The brick at the upper rim, worn to a smooth channel by the repeated passage of the rope, the lower courses still structurally sound, the water table accessible 4 or 5 meters below the courtyard floor. Craft activity in the residential blocks began in the morning, in the rooms nearest the street entrance, where light from the lane was supplemented by the reflected light of the courtyard. The debris that accumulated on these room floors over time tells the nature of the work done there with some specificity. In one concentration of rooms in the excavated portions of Mound E, the floor deposits were dense with the characteristic waste of flint blade production. Long prismatic blades struck from prepared cylindrical cores of fine-grained chert, the blades removed in a controlled sequence that left the core ridged and the blades parallel-sided and sharp along their edges. The chert came from sources in the Rory Hills in Sindh, several hundred kilometers to the south, transported in the form of prepared cores or in some cases as finished blades. The blades were used as cutting tools in a variety of tasks and were discarded when dulled, the floors of the workrooms accumulating layers of debitage, the rejected blades and the core maintenance flakes and the occasional broken core that marked the location of the work over years and decades. In other rooms, the floors carried concentrations of copper slag, small droplets of solidified copper oxide, and the hammered fragments of copper tools in the process of reshaping, indicating the presence of metalworking households that worked copper cold rather than smelting it on site. The raw copper arrived in the form of ingots or bars, traded in from sources in the Aravallis range in Rajasthan or from contacts further west in Oman. The metal workers used stone hammers and anvils of local hard stone to shape the copper into knives, chisels, fish hooks, and needles, the hammering work hardening the metal as it progressed and requiring periodic annealing, a brief reheating in a small hearth to restore ductility, the copper slag and the tool preforms in the floor deposits recording the sequence of operations, the discards of each stage accumulating where the worker sat. Shell working occupied its own set of rooms and produced a characteristic debris. Cut sections of conch shell, the cylinder of the shell body sawn through at intervals to produce blank rings from which bangles were finished by grinding and polishing on stone abraders. The conch came from the coast, probably as pre-prepared cylinders rather than whole shells, the first stage of processing having taken place near the source of the material. The finished bangles were a common ornament at Harappa, appearing on the skeletons of women in the cemetery areas in stacks of 10 or 15 on each forearm. The bones of the forearm showing in some individuals the periosteal remodeling that comes from years of contact with a firm circular band. The material economy of Harappa was built around craft traditions that required imported raw materials and technical knowledge accumulated across generations of practice. The most technically demanding of these crafts was the production of carnelian beads, and the sequence of operations involved in a single finished bead illustrates the level of specialization that Harappan production had reached. Raw carnelian came in unworked nodules from source deposits in the Saurashtra Peninsula in the far west of the subcontinent. Before the stone was cut to its final bead form, it was subjected to a heat treatment, fired in a kiln at temperatures near 400 degrees Celsius, which converted the pale yellow or gray silica of the unworked nodule to the warm red that is the diagnostic color of Harappan carnelian, and that also increased the hardness and toughness of the stone, reducing its tendency to fracture along natural cleavage planes. The fired stone was then ground to a rough cylindrical form on coarse sandstone grinding slabs, the surface of the slab becoming progressively orange-stained as the carnelian powder accumulated in its grain. The grinding took the stone through a series of progressively finer abrasive surfaces until the bead was close to its final proportions, at which point the drilling began. Drilling was done with fine copper rods spun in a bow drill, the drill tip working against the end face of the bead cylinder in a bed of fine abrasive powder. For long beads, the hole was drilled from both ends, and the two bore holes had to meet in the center within tolerances narrow enough that the finished string of beads hung straight and the thread wore evenly. Misaligned holes appear commonly in the preformed discards of the Harappan bead workshops, testifying to the difficulty of maintaining alignment through what might have been 15 or 20 minutes of continuous drilling in hard stone. Steatite seals were produced by a different process that began with the opposite material conditions. Steatite, or soapstone, is soft enough in its raw state to be carved with a narrow copper graver as easily as dense wood. The carver worked the image into the face of a small square or rectangular plaque, the incised design in intaglio, the image reading correctly when pressed into a flat surface of clay. The imagery of the seals was consistent across the Indus system. The Brahman bull, the one-horned animal that excavation literature called the unicorn, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the water buffalo, the tiger, and the tree, often paired with rows of the Indus script signs above the animal figure. After carving, the steatite was fired to temperatures near 900 degrees Celsius, which converted the soft surface of the stone to a hard white enstatite ceramic glaze, resistant to scratching and to the wear of repeated impressions in clay. The standardized weights in polished chert functioned as the infrastructure of a market economy distributed across hundreds of kilometers. The chert was a fine-grained, flint-like stone that could be brought to a high polish and that resisted the scratching and abrasion of handling. The weights were cuboid or barrel-shaped, their mass following a binary and decimal series. The smallest units weighed approximately 0.86 grams, and the series progressed by doubling, at ratios of 1 and 2 and 4 and 8 and 16 and 32, and by decimal multiples beyond that, reaching several kilograms in the largest examples. The same series has been recovered from sites across the Indus network, from Harappa in the north to Dholavira in the south. A merchant carrying Harappan weights from Harappa to a trading partner in Gujarat could establish the relationship between the two weight sets within the tolerances of the measurement without any administrative instruction. The chert weights serving as a shared language of quantity in an economy that left no written records of its transactions. The evidence that Harappa maintained sustained contact with Mesopotamia is not hypothetical. Etched carnelian beads of Harappan manufacture, recognizable by the heat treatment that produced their red color, and by the complex geometric patterns etched through a resist technique unique to the Indus tradition, have been recovered from the royal cemetery at Ur in contexts dated to approximately 2600 to 2400 before the Common Era, contemporary with the mature phase of Harappan occupation. They appear at other Mesopotamian sites as well, at Nippur and Kish, and in sites along the Euphrates, in numbers and in contexts that confirm a sustained trade rather than a single episode of gift exchange. The Mesopotamian administrative texts of the 3rd millennium give a name to the distant source of these goods, Meluha. The references occur in the records of the Akkadian period, roughly 2350 to 2150 before the Common Era, and describe ships from Meluha arriving at the ports of the Persian Gulf carrying carnelian, ivory, and a dark wood that the texts describe as appropriate for furniture. A merchant community identified as Meluhan appears in texts from the city of Lagash, probably resident in the city as intermediaries managing the flow of goods in both directions. In the opposite direction, from Mesopotamia and from the highlands of Iran and Afghanistan toward Harappa, moved materials that the Indus plain could not produce. Lapis lazuli was one of the most significant, a stone of deep blue, irreproducible in color by any other known material available to ancient craftspeople, sourced in the ancient world from a single major deposit at Sarisang in the Koksha Valley in what is now northeastern Afghanistan. From that source, the stone traveled overland through the settlements of northern Afghanistan and through the Bolan Pass or across the Makran coast into the Indus network, where it arrived at cities including Harappa in unworked nodule form and was cut, ground, and polished in local workshops into beads and inlays. Lapis workshop debris, rough nodules, and partially finished beads and grinding dust at Harappa confirms that the stone arrived raw and was finished at the destination rather than arriving as a finished product. Tin, necessary for making bronze alloys, came from sources not entirely established but probably including deposits in Afghanistan and possibly the Iranian plateau, moving along similar routes. Copper came from the Aravallis in Rajasthan and possibly from Oman, its movement traceable partly through the isotopic signatures of Harappan copper objects, which in some cases match Omani ore sources. Shell for bangle production came from the Gujarat coast and from the far western Indian Ocean. Within the Indus system itself, the trade was as significant as the external connections. The standardized weight set and the standardized ceramic repertoire and the standardized brick module all point to an integrated market in which producers in one region made goods for consumers at considerable distances. The seals whose impression in clay authenticated the content and origin of traded goods, serving as a form of verification that allowed exchange without a shared spoken language or a common administrative authority imposing the standards. The ground holds what the records do not. The weight sets, the seals, and the material distributions confirm the scope of the system more concretely than any administrative archive would. By late afternoon, when the direct sun had moved off the courtyard and the shadows of the house walls extended across the beaten floor, the rhythm of the household shifted. The craft work that required fine attention and good light had been done in the morning hours. The afternoon and evening were the time of food preparation and of the heavier domestic tasks that did not depend on precision. Cooking fires were rebuilt from the morning remnants, fed with larger pieces of fuel, the storage jars of grain and lentils opened, and their contents measured into ceramic mixing bowls. The storage jars of Harappa were among the most consistently produced objects in the city's ceramic repertoire. Tall, with short necks and thickened, slightly flared rims, their walls thrown on a fast wheel to a consistent thickness, their shoulders and rims painted with the horizontal bands and geometric motifs of the Harappan style in black slip-on red. The pottery assemblage of the residential levels of Mound E is enormous. Tens of thousands of sherds have been recovered from the mature phase deposits, and their distribution across the stratigraphic sequence allows a detailed reconstruction of the ceramic repertoire in use at different periods of the city's life. The most common forms were the storage jar, the dish on stand with its characteristic hollow perforated pedestal, and the small cup or goblet. The dish on stand appears in such quantities and in such consistent form across the site that it was clearly a standard household vessel. Its elevated platform and broad shallow bowl suited it to presenting food at a communal meal or to the movement of prepared food from the cooking area to the eating area without contact with the floor. The painted decoration on these vessels was applied freehand but followed a consistent vocabulary, intersecting circles, broad bands at the rim and shoulder, and periodic figurative motifs, the pipal leaf and the fish scale, and the short-horned bull standing in profile. The food that the storage jars and cooking vessels handled is recoverable from the charred seed assemblages and bone deposits in the midden areas of Mound E. Wheat and barley were the primary cereals, the wheat including both emmer and bread wheat varieties, the barley both hulled and naked forms. Lentils and field peas provided the protein complement to the cereal base, and sesame contributed both oil and seed. Fish were taken from the Ravi and from seasonal pools in the floodplain, their small bones concentrated in the midden deposits in numbers that indicate fish were a common food source rather than a periodic supplement. The species identifiable from vertebrae and otoliths included several types of catfish and carp suited to the slow-moving and seasonally flooded waters of the Punjab alluvium. Cattle were the most important domestic animal at Harappa. Both zebu and water buffalo were kept, their bones distinguishable in the faunal assemblage by size and by the morphological differences in their limb and cranial elements. Zebu were the primary draft animals, harnessed in pairs to the solid-wheeled carts, whose wheel ruts survive in some of the better preserved street surfaces, and their bones appear in the food deposits in numbers consistent with the slaughter of older animals whose working life was finished. Water buffalo required access to standing water for wallowing and were concentrated near the lower, wetter margins of the city, their larger bones appearing in faunal assemblages from those areas. Sheep and goat were kept in smaller numbers, their fleece and milk, as well as their meat, contributing to the household economy. And pig remains appear in the residential middens in proportions that suggest a scavenging relationship with the household, the animals living on refuse from the courtyards and lane dumps and slaughtered when the household needed protein. The evening in the residential blocks closed around the shared meal in the courtyard, the dish-on-stand form circulating food from the ceramic storage jars and the cooking hearth to the people of the household, the small cups and goblets holding the liquids that accompanied the meal. By the time the evening meal was finished and the fire banked, the stored grain and lentils replaced in their jars, the grinding stones and the spindle whorls set aside for the next morning, the city would have been quiet, except for the movement of cattle settling in the pens at the edges of the residential blocks, and the sound of the ravi moving past the city margin in the darkness. The smoke from the cooking fires, which had risen in visible columns through the day, thinned and dissipated in the cooler evening air, and the flat Punjab plain surrounding the city lay still under the late sky, the irrigated fields dark with moisture, and the dry margins beyond the field edges pale in whatever light the night provided. The dead at Harappa were buried with attention and with consistency across the centuries of the city's occupation. The two main cemetery areas, known in the excavation literature as R37 and Cemetery H, occupied different portions of the site and represent different periods in its history. But the mature Harappan burials of R37 established a practice that was regular enough to constitute a tradition in the demographic record of the site. The body was laid extended on its back, the legs straight, the arms at the sides or folded across the pelvis, the head oriented to the north and the feet to the south. The grave was cut into the sandy soil of the cemetery area and sometimes lined with a few courses of mud brick, the base of the grave receiving the body on what the soil staining suggests was a wooden bier or a mat of woven reeds. At the head and at the feet, pottery vessels were placed in numbers ranging from 3 or 4 in the simpler burials to over 30 in the most fully furnished ones, the vessels being the same forms used in daily life: storage jars and dish-on-stands and small cups, rather than a special mortuary pottery produced only for burial. In some burials, the pottery showed evidence of intentional breaking before deposition, the vessels struck and placed in fragments around the body, a practice for which no direct explanation is recoverable from the material record. Personal ornaments accompanied most of the buried individuals. Shell bangles of the conch section type produced in the craft workshops of Mound E stacked on the forearms of female individuals in numbers that matched the periosteal remodeling of the forearm bones from long contact with a rigid circular band. Copper bangles at wrists, steatite bead necklaces across the chest. The distribution of ornaments across the cemetery population showed the range expected in a settled agricultural community, with some burials notably more richly furnished than others. But no burial at Harappa showed the extreme concentration of prestige goods of the roughly contemporary royal cemetery at Ur. No weapons were buried with the dead, and no object in the Harappan material record from any site has been identified with confidence as a weapon designed for interpersonal violence. The copper objects of the tool assemblage, knives and chisels and saws and fishhooks, were functional tools. None reads unambiguously as a blade designed to cut a person rather than a material. The skeletal evidence from the cemetery populations at Harappa and from other Indus sites does not show the frequency of healed or unhealed blade injuries, perimortem fractures, or projectile point embeds, that characterize skeletal assemblages from populations with significant rates of organized violence. This pattern has attracted sustained comment from researchers because it is consistent across the evidence and not easily dismissed as an artifact of excavation. No structure interpreted as a temple has been identified at Harappa, and no imagery of a clearly divine figure occurs in the seal corpus in a way that permits confident identification of a specific deity. Mohenjo-Daro, the other large Indus city excavated to a comparable depth, had a structure long called the Great Bath, a large brick-lined pool interpreted as a place of ritual bathing. Harappa has no equivalent structure clearly identified. The platform structures on Mound AB have been interpreted as granaries and as civic precincts, but none of the interpretations has found definitive support in the artifacts recovered from those contexts. The terracotta figurines of female figures, many of them with elaborate headdresses of baked clay, appear in large numbers in the residential contexts of Mound E, their distribution domestic rather than associated with any public or monumental structure, their deposition in household floor deposits and courtyard fills and refuse areas outside house walls suggesting household rather than public use. Whether they functioned as votive objects or as representations of a protective presence, or as children's toys, or as some combination of these purposes is not resolvable from the distribution data and the form alone. They were common enough that their production was distributed across households throughout the city, the same broad population that produced the terracotta animal figurines, cattle and dogs and sheep and birds, that appear in equal numbers in the domestic deposits. The agricultural year at Harappa was organized around two cropping cycles governed by different rainfall systems. The winter cycle, the Rabi, was fed by the westerly frontal rains that moved across Pakistan and the Punjab between November and March, light enough to supplement the soil moisture left by the retreating monsoon, but not sufficient to water crops without the addition of irrigation. Wheat and barley were planted in October, after the Kharif harvest was complete and the soil was still moist from the monsoon season, and they grew through the cool months at the slow pace of cool season cereals, accumulating green mass through December and January before heading in February and maturing to harvest in March and April. The harvest in those months, when the temperature was rising and the grain was drying on the stalk, brought the city its principal food surplus. The wheat and barley cut from the fields, brought in on the solid-wheeled carts, threshed on the circular brick platforms near the northern edge of Mound AB, winnowed in the prevailing westerly wind, and stored in the long, narrow chambers of the granary structures on the raised platform. The summer cycle, the Kharif, was governed by the Indian summer monsoon, which came in from the southwest in late June, reached the Punjab in July, peaked in August with heavy rainfall and high humidity, and began withdrawing in September. Cotton and sesame, and in wetter and lower areas along the floodplain rice and sorghum, were planted in June just before the rains arrived, the seed going into soil that was still dry enough to work. The crops grew through the monsoon months on rainfall supplemented by the irrigation channels, whose flow was at its maximum in August, when the river was at its highest stage. Cotton was harvested in September and October as the monsoon receded and the bolls opened, the picking done by hand over several passes through the field, as different portions of the plant matured at slightly different rates. The cotton was brought to the household courtyards and ginned, the seeds and debris combed away from the fiber on wooden combs or toothed implements, and the cleaned fiber set to spinning. The Ravi's seasonal character shaped every aspect of life at the site. In the monsoon months, it was wide and fast and brown, carrying heavy loads of silt from its headwaters in the outer Himalayas and the Siwalik Hills, its level elevated above the floodplain margins, and its water accessible at the banks without deep excavation. By May and June it had dropped significantly, the flow sustained by groundwater contribution and by the tail of the winter snowmelt, and the irrigation channels required more careful management. The brick drains within the city served different functions across the seasonal cycle. In the monsoon months, they were primarily stormwater channels, moving rainfall and mound runoff away from the street surfaces and house walls. In the drier months, they carried the domestic wastewater of washing and bathing from the household drains to the collecting channels at the city's edge. The seasonal fluctuation was built into the design of the drainage system, which was dimensioned to handle the heavy storm flows of August, while also functioning adequately during the minimal flows of April and May. The fields on the floodplain below the city margin received a new deposit of silt with each significant flood, the fine material settling from the floodwater as it spread across the low ground and slowed, renewing the chemical fertility of the soil without the application of any external amendment. The farmers of Harappa managed their field layouts to take advantage of this renewal. The orientation of the irrigation channels implies a long strip field system running perpendicular to the main river channel. The strips designed to distribute the floodwater broadly across the maximum number of plots, and to allow each strip to receive its share of the new silt, rather than allowing the flood to concentrate in a single channel and deposit most of its load in one place. The seasonal cycle of the Rabi and the Kharif, the high river of August and the low river of June, the westerly winds of the threshing platforms and the monsoon rains of the cotton fields, ran without substantial interruption for 7 centuries, and the city grew within that cycle and was sustained by it. The contraction of Harappa was not a single event, but a process distributed over at least 2 centuries. In the uppermost occupation levels of Mound E, the careful maintenance of drains and streets that characterized the mature city was no longer in evidence. Covered drains were left unrepaired when their flat brick covers broke under the weight of foot traffic, the open channel filling with wind-blown dust and street debris. Street surfaces that had been relaid every few generations in the mature phase were not replaced after the last episode of wear. The regular cycle of house rebuilding, visible in the stratigraphic sections as alternating layers of occupation surface and new brick wall, slowed and eventually stopped. Buildings that had been continuously maintained for generations were allowed to weather, their upper courses collapsing inward and their collapsed debris forming the sloping layers in the section walls that mark the end of active occupation. Cemetery H, in the northern part of the site, overlies the mature Harappan deposits there and represents the community that remained at Harappa through and after the main phase of urban contraction. The pottery of the Cemetery H assemblage was distinct from the classic Harappan repertoire in ways that indicated genuine cultural change. The forms shifted, the painted motifs introduced new elements. A peepal tree with peacocks perched in its branches and figures on bullock carts and star and sun patterns that had no clear antecedents in the painted vocabulary of the mature Harappan ceramic tradition. The burial practice in Cemetery H was also different. Some individuals were cremated and their remains placed in large painted urns, a practice entirely absent from the R37 cemetery of the mature phase. The Cemetery H community was present at Harappa in its location and retained some connections to the Harappan material tradition. But it was not the same community that had built and maintained the mature city. It was, at the very least, a community that had changed substantially in its cultural practices and probably in its composition. The Ravi contributed to the conditions that made the mature city no longer viable in its established form. Paleochannel mapping of the Punjab alluvium using remote sensing data shows that the main course of the Ravi shifted progressively away from the city during the late Harappan phase, reducing and eventually cutting off the direct river access that had supplied the city with water for bathing and washing beyond the reach of the wells, with fish from the river itself and from the seasonal pools left by floods, with the transport corridor that the river provided for the movement of goods by boat, and with the seasonal silt delivery that renewed the agricultural land immediately below the city margins. The irrigation channels that had drawn from the nearby Ravi were now extended. Their maintenance burden increased, their reliability reduced. The city in its mature form had been optimized for a river that no longer ran where the city stood. The monsoon weakening that paleoclimate records indicate for the centuries following 1900 before the Common Era acted on the same agricultural system from a different direction. A shorter or less reliable Kharif growing season reduced the cotton and sesame surplus that fed the long-distance trade through the Persian Gulf. Reduced trade reduced the flow of imported materials that supplied the craft industries. Reduced craft production made the urban economy less competitive with the smaller agricultural settlements in better watered regions. The population that left Harappa did not leave the agricultural economy. Settlement data from the upper Gangetic Plain and from the Doab between the Yamuna and the Ganges shows an increase in small site density in the early second millennium, the same period as the contraction of the Indus cities. The communities that moved eastward toward the Gangetic Plain carried some Harappan material practices with them, the fired brick module appearing in some successor period contexts, and some of the ceramic forms showing continuity with the mature Harappan repertoire. But the scale of the city, the drainage infrastructure, the standardized weight system enforced across hundreds of kilometers, the dense urban fabric of the mature Indus phase, none of these features reconstituted themselves in the new locations. Harappa today is in Sal district in Punjab province, Pakistan, the mounds of the ancient city lying on both sides of the Lahore-Multan railway line, which was laid through the site in the 1850s. The engineers and contractors who built the railway used Harappan-fired bricks as ballast for the trackbed, taking them from the exposed portions of the mounds in the understanding that ancient ruins were a convenient source of fired material requiring no further processing. Several early observers, including Alexander Cunningham, who served as the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, noted the bricks in the railway ballast and recognized them as ancient, reporting the distinctive proportions, the same 1:2:4 ratio that governed their manufacture 4,000 years before they were pulled from the mound, in correspondence that drew attention to the site as something more than a local earthwork. Serious excavation did not begin until 1921, when Dayaram Sani of the Archaeological Survey opened the trenches that first revealed the planned streets and covered drains of the mature city. The discovery of Harappa and the almost simultaneous discovery of Mohenjo-Daro to the south established the existence of the Indus Valley civilization as a Bronze Age urban culture comparable in scale and complexity to those of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and apparently independent of them in its development. John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey at the time, published the findings in 1924, announcing the existence of a civilization in the Indus Valley of which no historical record had survived in any adjacent tradition, a civilization that could be dated by the stratigraphic correspondence of its pottery and seals with Mesopotamian materials to the mid-3rd millennium before the Common Era. The announcement reconfigured the map of the ancient world. The mounds of Harappa today are the product of a century of excavation and of the centuries of settlement, cultivation, and brick robbing that preceded it. The profiles of Mound AB and Mound E gentler than they were in the 1920s, the edges rounded by excavation spoil and by the slow weathering of exposed brickwork and earth. In the portions of the site consolidated for study and visitor access, the street surfaces of Mound E are exposed and walkable, the walls of the residential blocks standing to a meter or more in places. The spatial logic of the ancient city, courtyard and interior room and lane and main street and drain, readable in 3 dimensions from the preserved courses of fired brick. The brick itself is the most durable thing the city produced, fired to a hardness that resists the biological and chemical degradation of 4,000 years in Punjab soil. The 1224 module still measurable in the excavated courses, the joints between courses still sharp enough in sheltered sections to show the mortar lines. The research program at the site has been active in most decades since the 1920s, most consistently through the Harappa Archaeological Research Project, which has worked here since 1986 in partnership with the Department of Archaeology and Museums of Pakistan. The project's excavations have focused partly on the deep sequences below the mature city, tracing the earlier Ravi and Kotdijan phases of occupation that preceded the grid streets and standardized brick of the mature Harappan period, and extending the radiocarbon chronology of the site back to 3300 before the Common Era and earlier. The Indus script inscribed on the steatite seals remains unread. More than 4,000 seals and seal impressions have been recovered from sites across the Indus network, the corpus comprising between 300 and 400 distinct signs, a number consistent with a logosyllabic writing system of moderate complexity, though the absence of a bilingual text has prevented the decipherment that would allow the sign values to be established independently. The script appears on the seals in short sequences, rarely more than 20 signs, typically arranged above the animal figure in a line or two. What those sequences recorded, the name of the seal's owner, or the content and origin of a traded packet or a title or some other designation, is not recoverable from the sign forms alone. At dusk, when the light from the west comes in low and raking across the mound surfaces, and the exposed brickwork throws long shadows along the joints between courses, the courses of the covered drains are still visible in the trench walls of the excavated sections. The fired brick of the channel covers still spanning the open channel below, still carrying the load of the 4 meters of collapsed house debris above them. The same brick and the same proportions, and the same careful jointing that the city's builders laid down 4,000 years ago in the Punjab plain beside the Ravi. The site is still there. The city is not.